So we released our 2024 Fantasy Football Fellas draft guide a little over a week ago. And as more and more people start to come up with their rankings and their draft guides, I like to take my personal rankings and compare them to see who I'm much more bullish on, who I'm much more in on, and who I'm much more out on compared to other people's rankings. And courtesy of the Fantasy Pros expert consensus ranking tool that takes over 60 experts' rankings and puts them into a consensus ranking, there are 5 players that I believe that these experts are wrong about, guys that are underranked, undervalued, underappreciated even, that we need to be more in on and talk about more often. And there are other players that may be overranked, that overvalued, overappreciated, that may not exactly return where they are ranked right now in draft. So we're going to talk about those 5 players today. Let's get on into it. First player that we're going to talk about is DeVonta Smith, who the experts have ranked as their consensus wide receiver 22. And he's personally my wide receiver 26 as of right now. I have a projected for 78 receptions on 120 targets for a little over 1,000 yards and 5 touchdowns. And wide receiver finishes in these Kellen Moore offenses may not be as great as we want them to be or think that they will be based on where they go in drafts, right? But we take a look at the 2 fully healthy seasons of Dak Prescott in Dallas when Kellen Moore was his offensive coordinator. In 2019, Amari Cooper was the wide receiver 10, and Michael Gallup was the wide receiver 23. And in 2021, CeeDee Lamb was the wide receiver 19, and Amari Cooper was the wide receiver 27. And those were with a 4,000-yard passer in Dak Prescott. And we take a look at Dak Prescott's stats compared to Jalen Hurts's, right? We take those 2 years in 2019 and 2021. They are completely different than any season that Jalen Hurts has had as a starter, right? We see Dak with 4,900 passing yards, 4,500 yards. We see 30 passing touchdowns, 37 passing touchdowns, and almost 600 passing attempts. Jalen Hurts has never gotten anywhere close with any of those stats. 538 pass attempts, 3,800 passing yards, 23 passing touchdowns. It's pretty obvious to say that these are 2 very different quarterbacks. But if we're not going to get a 4,000-yard passer in Jalen Hurts, how high can these Eagles wide receivers finish with maybe just 3,800 passing yards? And we saw Dallas Cowboys wide receivers only one top 10 finish of any of them with a fully healthy and a 4,000-yard passer in Dak Prescott. Now, we've seen DeVonta Smith finish better than any of those in 2022, right? He finished as the wide receiver 9, and Jalen Hurts only threw for 3,700 passing yards in that season. But that was on a 27% target share. And we take the other 2 seasons then, DeVonta Smith only averages a 22.5% target share with Jalen Hurts as his starter, right? I respect the wide receiver 22 ranking, but my wide receiver 26 ranking reflects the low floor that I perceive, I should say, that comes with DeVonta Smith this year, being in Philly with this Kellen Moore offense where you have a mobile quarterback in Jalen Hurts, a dominant running back in Saquon Barkley with Dallas Goedert, who we should not neglect in this offense either, and a clear one in AJ Brown ahead of him. I think there's a lower floor with DeVonta Smith this year. So my wide receiver 26 ranking is what reflects that. Is there a world where he can be better than the wide receiver 26, be better than the wide receiver 22? I think so, but I would err on the side of no, just because I think the odds are stacked against him. So Mike Evans won a lot of people their leagues and won them a lot of money as well, because Mike Evans was one of the biggest returns on investment last year for a guy that was going somewhere in the 30s for wide receivers, finished as a top 10 wide receiver. And this year, according to the experts over on Fantasy Pros, they have him consensusly ranked as the wide receiver 14, and I still have him as a top 10 wide receiver. I have him projected for 82 receptions on 140 targets for 1,173 yards and 9 touchdowns. And we take a look at Mike Evans' stats so far in his career, right? We see 1,000 yards in every single season. That is historic. But we can't ignore the fact that in 3 of his last 4 years, Evans has had 13 or more touchdowns, and that definitely has fueled his finishes over that span, right? You take a look at the last 4 years and we remove the touchdowns and just look at volume and just the touches that he gets. He's averaging 75 receptions on 121 targets for 1,100 yards. Yes, touchdowns play a big part in Mike Evans' fantasy outlook. But the other part of this is we can't ignore the loss of Dave Canales in this Tampa offense, right? He helped rejuvenate Baker Mayfield. He really helped produce big seasons then for Mike Evans and also Rashad White as well. But The reason why I'm still in on Mike Evans, despite these things, despite a likely regression coming in the touchdown category, offensive coordinator Liam Cohen, who is now the new offensive coordinator, knows that he can get Mike Evans the ball just based on his experience in previous landing spots, right? Being offensive coordinator in Kentucky, but most specifically, with the LA Rams and Sean McVay. Take a look at this clip.
That's a great question. That's something that was asked a lot, and we had to do in LA a ton because we knew that, that offense ran through Coop. And things have changed a little bit there, but he's gotten a little bit more help. But things ran through him, and we had to be creative, right? With whether it was by formation, alignment, where we would put him, how we would end up in the final formation. Just by 3 different formations, double Dixie and Daffy, we just moved the F in 3 different positions. So ultimately, at the end of the day, we have to be able to move him around by formation, but also motion. Do we start him in the backfield? Do we bring him in the backfield and now try to shuffle him out and be able to get him matched up on a will or a nickel or a backer or a down safety? Mike obviously being the size that he is and his ability to be able to track the football down the field, but also his ability to get in and out of cuts at that size, man, to be able to put him inside a little bit more and to be able to run some of those option routes and choice routes on the inside, man, I think that's a winning edge and something that we'd like to be able to utilize.
So, with his time with the Rams, with Sean McVay, and really learning how to build this offense through a guy like Cooper Kupp, we're going to see a lot of Mike Evans utilization in this offense, right? And even as Cohen said, using him inside, letting him use those choice routes and those option routes, and also the deep ball as well. I think Liam Cohen is very, very excited about having a guy like Mike Evans, who really is just kind of a jack of all trades, a wild card, a guy that is a physical beast, right? Because of his size, his strength, and his speed. It's going to be very, very hard for defenses to cover a guy like Mike Evans in this system. So, are we going to see double digit touchdowns again from Mike Evans? I err on the side of no, because again, 13, 14, 6, and 13 touchdowns in his last 4 seasons. We are probably going to see 8 or 9 touchdowns, but I think this offense can still allow Evans to finish as a fantasy wide receiver 1 and potentially top 10, according to where I have him ranked. Next guy that we're going to talk about, I've talked about plenty already this season. I'm already sick and tired of talking about him, but we're going to keep talking about him just because I think that he is not being valued or going in drafts right now at the appropriate price. It is Brandon Aiyuk. According to that FantasyPros ECR tool, he's the wide receiver 13. He is personally my wide receiver 20. I am just not in, as some people are, on Brandon Aiyuk this year. I have him projected for 72 receptions on 109 targets for just shy of 1,100 yards and 7 touchdowns. And just for context, that is 15.1 yards per reception, and that is on the highest target share of this Niners offense. And we take a look at Aiyuk stats in his 4-year career so far. I think you can tell which year is kind of the outlier year, or what year was the hyper efficient year, the spike year, whatever you want to call it. It was very clearly last year, right? 1,300 yards, almost 18 yards per reception. That is that is outlier of all outlier when you compare that year to his previous 3 years. And you take a look at his expected fantasy points per game, and again, expected fantasy points just takes into consideration how a player was utilized in their offense and the fantasy points you would expect out of that kind of usage and that utilization. Brandon Ayuk on a per game basis, the wide receiver 36 in expected fantasy points per game. So we can use that, and we can look at his historical data and go, yeah, last year was an outlier, was a hyper efficient year, and there's nothing wrong with it. But that just makes you a very likely candidate to regress. And let's take the previous 3-year average in his yards per reception of 13.4 and use that with his volume and touchdowns last year. That's nearly a 4.5 yard per reception decrease just right off the rip. But that would have resulted in 75 receptions on 105 targets for a little over 1,000 yards, 1,007 yards to be exact, and 7 touchdowns. That would have been the wide receiver 25. That would have been 13.6 fantasy points per game, wide receiver 26 on a per game basis. The only way that he can finish this high as this wide receiver 13, according to the rankings, and sometimes going even higher just in best ball drafts, the only way that he can finish that high or even best that is to get an uptick in volume. Okay. It's and I would say that it's not going to happen. Okay. You still have Christian McCaffrey. You still have Kyle Shanahan as the play caller. So you know the offense is going to go through Christian McCaffrey and off the play action. Then you still have George Kittle. You still have Debo Samuel. And now you have first rounder Ricky Pearsall in the room as well. It is going to be a very frustrating year for Brandon Ayuk. In again, wide receiver 20, he is still going to play a role in fantasy. But if you are taking him at that wide receiver 13 range, he's a fringe wide receiver 1 at that price tag. You are expecting top 10 results every now and then from the guy. I don't think that happens just because we are going to see some kind of regression from Brandon Ayuk. I've opened myself back up to getting hurt again by T. Higgins. And you know what? I think this might be an early candidate for flag plants. I know it's only June 10th, so it is kind of early to say that a guy might be a flag plant, but seriously, I just do not get the hate or the dislike for T. Higgins with how this Cincinnati offseason has gone, right? But let's go back to T. Higgins real quick. According to that ECR tool on Fantasy Pros, he's the wide receiver 29. He is personally my wide receiver 16. Yes, I am much higher on T. Higgins than the consensus rankings over on Fantasy Pros. I have him projected for 82 receptions on 129 targets, a little over 1,100 yards, and 6 touchdowns. The question that we've been asking about T. Higgins the past 2 years at least has been, can he take the next step? Can he take the next step and command more targets? The question that we can ask this year is very different than the past 2 seasons. We are no longer asking, can he take the next step? What we now know is that he can and he should command more targets because there is at least a clear path for him to get more targets. Maybe he doesn't need to take the step forward. Maybe the targets will just fall in his direction because of just who has left the building and who has come in, right? We take a look at the top 5 target getters from this Bengals offense last year, right? You got Jamar Chase, you got Tyler Boyd, you got T. Higgins, you got Joe Mixon, and Tanner Hudson, right? After this offseason, there is no more Tyler Boyd in this offense. There is no more Joe Mixon. And a little ways down the way, a little further down, you could say, Irv Smith. He is gone as well. He had 28 targets, I believe. And I doubt that Tanner Hudson is going to see 50 targets again with Mike Gesicki in town. So that's already 190 vacated targets by Boyd, by Mixon, and by Irv Smith. And if you took 20 of Hudson's 50 targets away, we are now looking at 210 vacated targets in this Cincinnati offense with what we believe to be a fully healthy Joe Burrow. How do targets not fall to T. Higgins in this situation, right? And especially then when you see, okay, all that they did this offseason, they brought in Jermaine Burton in the 3rd round. Look, I'm a big fan of Jermaine Burton, but I don't see him commanding more than 90 targets his rookie season. Okay. So let's say we give Jermaine Burton 80 targets, right? Of those 210 vacated, we are now looking at 130 open targets. They went out and signed Zach Moss to a 2-year, $8 million deal with just $3 million guaranteed. Okay. So if the running game isn't where it needs to be, what isn't where it used to be with Joe Mixon, Cincinnati can really cut their losses after this year. But in terms of this year, if the run game isn't working, that means they're going to be throwing the ball more often, right? That's when you were going to see Jamar Chase. That's when we're going to see more T. Higgins, right? So even more good things in that sense. But let's say Zach Moss gets 30 targets because he has not gotten more than 35 in a single season in his career, right? And then we give another 30 to Chase Brown. That's 60. Of that 130, there are still 70 targets just up for grabs. I don't think it's that far of a stretch to say that T. Higgins should get at least 25 of those, get at least 30 of those. And if he does, then there's the uptick in volume that we have been waiting for so long. And the question has always been, can he take that next step forward? Can he command more targets? We don't have to ask that question anymore because the targets are just there. We don't need him to elevate his game. He can be the player that he always has been, but the targets will just come his way naturally. So again, there is a clear path. T. Higgins, this is the lowest that we're probably going to see T. Higgins go in drafts. scoop them up every time you can, because again, there is a clear path to more targets and more opportunities for a guy like T. Higgins in an offense that is going to throw the ball a ton. That's what we know about this Cincinnati offense. The wide receiver 29 is just too low for me. Maybe I'm too high at the wide receiver 16. But again, I think there is a much more optimistic outlook for T. Higgins than the last 2 years. The expectations for Michael Pittman Jr. this year are very, very high after we saw him emerge and break out as the number one guy in this Indy offense under Shane Steichen, right? According to that ECR tool on Fantasy Pros, he's the wide receiver 12. He is a fringe wide receiver one, low end wide receiver one, high end wide receiver two, whatever you want to call it. I think wide receiver 12 means you are a wide receiver one. You are bona fide wide receiver one as a pillar of any team that you draft if you were to take him at that wide receiver 12 spot, right? He's currently my wide receiver 17, excuse me. 93 receptions, 150 targets, a little over 1,000 yards, and 5 touchdowns is my current stat projection for him. And again, we know that he's the one. And now we go into year 2 with Shane Steichen, and we're going to get a full season of Anthony Richardson. So there is a lot of optimism. There is a lot of steam for Michael Pittman to improve on what he did last year. The holdup for me is the touchdowns and how he's utilized in this Indy offense. Okay. We know what the volume is going to be like. Okay. I have him statted for 90 receptions, and I believe last year he had over 100 receptions. Okay. We know what the volume is going to look like, but can he get 6 touchdowns? He only had 4 last year. And since 2020, there have been 5 wide receivers to finish top 12 in their season finishes while scoring just 6 touchdowns. Puka last year, we had Amon-Ra in 2022, Keenan Allen in 2021. Deebo Samuel also did, but I'm not including him because he did score 8 rushing touchdowns that year. So a little bit of an anomaly in that sense. But then in 2020, we saw Allen Robinson and DeAndre Hopkins do it as well. So there is a path when it comes to cracking the top 12 with 6 touchdowns. We just need to see 2 more touchdowns. And I think there's opportunity for it, right? For a guy that's going to get 100, at least 140 targets, I should say it like that. There should be 2 more touchdowns there in store, right? We should be able to see 6 touchdowns. But the other side of this is how he's utilized. His 13 deep targets were by far the lowest of any top 15 wide receiver last year. And it actually is top 5 lowest, or within the top 5 lowest of all wide receivers since 2020 when it comes to finishing top 15. He's always been that kind of player. He has never been the downfield threat. He's always been in the short game. His ADOT has always been super, super low. There's nothing wrong with that. But what I think that should tell you is that with the volume that he gets, right, and being utilized in the short areas of the field, it should tell you that he's a good floor player, that he gives you a good high floor, but the ceiling isn't necessarily there just yet, right? Again, we're drafting him based on this perceived upside, on the perceived fact that he can better this wide receiver 13 on just 4 touchdowns. Is there a path? I absolutely think there is. I can't buy into it just yet because, again, what the ranking comes down to, if you see upside, if you see touchdown upside and all those kind of things, if you see a ceiling, you see a high ceiling, then he's probably a top 12 wide receiver for you. And I completely understand it. But if you just see him as a high floor wide receiver with a fairly limited ceiling just because of red zone opportunities and all those kind of things and how he's utilized, then you see him as this high end wide receiver 2, somewhere in this wide receiver 13 to 17 range. Maybe 17 is a little too harsh. Again, it's June 10th. There is a lot of time for all of our rankings and stat projections to be adjusted as we hear news about training camps and all those kind of things. But as of right now, I still see Michael Pittman as this high floor guy that has a relatively cap ceiling just because you have an offense with Anthony Richardson and Jonathan Taylor. I just think it's a little more, it's going to be a little more difficult for Michael Pittman to crack this top 12 and have this top 10 upside than I think people perceive. That's it. Those are the 5 wide receivers that I believe the experts are wrong about, according to the expert consensus rankings over on Fantasy Pros. Again, it's a great tool just to see how you rank up against other people, or players that you are more bullish on, more in on, more, and guys that you are just not as in on, that you don't really see the upside, you don't really get the argument for, and that is okay. If you want to check out that ranking, I will link that in the description below just for you to check out yourself. You can see it in PPR and standard and half PPR. And again, it's over 60 experts and their rankings combined into one list. It's a great, great tool to use. And as for me, I will see you tomorrow on the newest episode of the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast. You don't want to miss it. So until then, deuces.